The male form. Lithe, sinewy, graceful. The ancient Greeks believed the male physique represented perfection. In the 20th century, one artist spent his life trying to replicate that perfection, and that artist was Bruce Sargeant.
Bruce Sargeant is a very enigmatic figure in British and American art. It's hard to place him, really.
His really steadfast commitment to the human form and the male body is really quite amazing. And I really think that he would have contributed a lot had he lived longer.
As is the case with anyone who dies young, we wonder what would have happened if they had lived a full life.
Bruce Sargeant was, and still is, an enigma to the world at large. To unravel the secret life of Bruce Sargeant, one can start with Sargeant's great-nephew, artist Mark Beard.
Bruce Sargeant was my great-uncle. There were actually a whole number of artists. I had a great-grandfather who's kind of well-known regional painter, but Bruce Sargeant is the one that's most interesting to me because Bruce Sargeant is the most like me. He was my gay great-uncle. I never met him. He died in a wrestling accident in 1938 in Rotherham, England. He was half American and half English like I am. I have an English mother and an American father, and he had something similar. He was an academic painter somewhat. He studied at the Slade in the 20s and 30s under a French academic named Hippolyte Alexandre Michelon. He made a lot of portraits of athletes. He painted a lot of pictures of the local Northern English bourgeoisie, things like that. Well, I was fascinated by him growing up. I just saw these paintings of all of these young, heroic men, and I thought, oh, this is kind of an interesting way to paint and also I've always been interested in academic painting somewhat.
Just outside Sheffield, England, is the small town of Rotherham. And it was here, in the last years of the 19th century, that Bruce Sargeant's story really began.
Bruce Sargeant was born in Sheffield, England in 1898. Even though he was British, he had a great affiliation with the United States, a great love for things American. He came here when he was fairly young, went to the American West.
Bruce Sargeant was trained in the high classical manner found from the late 16th century in Rome and then at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris.
Then he studied in England. He came back to the United States several times, exhibited some of his work here. So by the time he was in his 20s, he did have something of a growing reputation on both sides of the Atlantic.
Bruce Sargeant's style of painting and sculpture, I think, is absolutely fascinating. It borrows from an older tradition, of course, but he really was painting in a style specific to him.
Bruce Sargeant's style, if you look at it in the context of what was going on in the 20s and 30s, he's at the very end of this formal classic tradition. If you go into a museum, they're going to say the 30s was a time when abstract expressionism took hold. You're starting to see the sort of the end of the painterly process. But there were Americans like Paul Cadmus, and there were other English painters who wanted to combine the formal technique with a modern aesthetic.
Bruce Sargeant was very straightforward. I don't think he had a sense of irony or much of a sense of humor. I think most of his pictures were just basically what he saw. I don't think he thought about what he did other than trying to make a good painting and a graceful painting. My painting is a little more ironic and not so straightforward, but then it would be because I live in New York in 2007.
Bruce Sargeant's straightforward style harks back to a time when art was practiced in a more formal tradition with set parameters. This tradition reached its height at the turn of the 20th century in Paris, at the greatest art institution of its time.
The École des Beaux-Arts was this great French academy that established certain rules. Basically, everything was based on the human figure. You drew and you drew and you drew, and from that came everything else.
The École des Beaux-Arts was the bastion of academic training. All of that tradition came down to Bruce Sargeant through Michelin, who was Sargeant's teacher and a direct descendant of the great academic artists of the 19th century.
Probably no one had a greater influence over the impressionable Bruce Sargeant than his mentor, Hippolyte Alexandre Michelin.
Michelin was really a grand seigneur of the European tradition, and one thinks of photographs of him with a long pointing stick and a long beard and a kind of poofed out beret.
Hippolyte Alexandre Michelin was a fairly ordinary man, a product of his time and his social class. His father was an undertaker in the city of Tours in the Loire Valley. His mother was an amateur artist. She painted insects. And so he was exposed to art at an early age. And it was rather enlightened of his parents to agree that he be sent to Paris to study officially and to learn the academic tradition.
Hippolyte is very much a product of the 19th century École des Beaux-Arts. He's extremely adequate. He's not a great artist. The work is workmanlike. It's not inspired, but it has a certain interest.
He had sort of numerous artistic tragedies, I would say. He had a fire in his studio in 1880. All of his work was destroyed, and then he really did not achieve great success and sort of moved on from history painting to painting animals.
Well, in my opinion, the animal paintings are his best paintings. The light is handled much better than in his classical compositions, which they don't breathe. They're dark, they're cramped. There's a kind of air circulating through the animal paintings. There's a certain dynamic quality in the composition that really shines through. In 1893, Michelin decided to move to London, and it's unclear exactly why, whether for personal or professional reasons. He didn't speak any English, so that didn't help. But he went to London. A few years later, he was approached by the director of the Slade to teach perspective and composition. Again, not, in my opinion, his strengths, but he was the last academic professor at the Slade. So Bruce Sargeant naturally gravitated toward him.
He may have been second rate, but he was a probably very good teacher and very able to teach drawing and painting to his students.
I think great teachers are important because they're the legacies of very fine students who then themselves perhaps become teachers.
In the 20s, of course, the rise of Expressionism and Surrealism were really, the artists were turning their attention to those movements. But Sargeant at the Slade was really focused in the academic tradition and the human form. So he sort of rejected all of these new developments in a way and really created his own style of realism that was very personal.
I think Bruce Sargeant was a better painter than Michelin. Something tells me that Bruce Sargeant wouldn't have needed Michelin's example to show his interest in the male form. If anything, any instruction he would have had, frankly, from Michelin would have set him back.
I think we can safely say that Sargeant, having been trained by an academic teacher, was basically